to that. And today I'm introducing Jeremiah Asher, who's going to be our speaker today. So Jeremiah is the Assistant Director at the Institute of Water Research, which is at Michigan State University. So Jeremiah is the project principal investigator for this project that he's going to be talking about today, and oversees and provides technical expertise on this. So let's welcome Jeremiah, and I'm going to pass things off to him.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you, everybody, for taking time over lunch today to learn a little bit about our performance-based conservation adoption program in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Today, I'll be providing an overview of the project, what is pay-for-performance or performance-based conservation practices, which is our program here, why performance matters, talk a little bit about the enrollment process that we're planning for this project, and then also touch on our advisory board who's helping us with the planning process and working out the details for how the program will be structured. So this project's funded by the Michigan Department of Ag and Rural Development. It's led by the Institute of Water Research at Michigan State University, and we're partnering with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, MSU Center for Regen Ag, and the Michigan State University Extension. The project has funding of about $12 million in total. $7 million of that is going toward conservation payments to producers for putting in conservation practices. About $1 million is going toward incentive payments that are going to what we're calling technical assistance providers who will help with the enrollment of producers into the program. And then about $4 million is going into the development, management, and implementation of the program over a 7-year period. So I'll talk a little bit about the project timeline for this. We started in June of this year, and we did a kickoff, which was kind of a high-level presentation that we did at the State of the Lake Conference in Adrian, Michigan. And then as we rolled into July, we really started our project planning and development phase. As I mentioned earlier, this phase will go, it's about a year long, so starting in July, all the way through up into the summer, just before we enroll or start making enrollment available for the program. In September of this year, we started our model incorporation that's using SWAT. SWAT is the kind of the engine behind our tools for estimating reductions in phosphorus from conservation practices. And then in November, we started moving into developing our interface that people will interact with on the online platform. We have a few additional interface slides or pages that we're designing, and then we'll be moving into a testing phase starting in January and February for those, where we'll get feedback internally and then externally from users. And then we'll start enrolling producers in the summer of 2026, and then from 2026 to 2032 is when the program will be active in enrolling producers, and then we will end in September of 2032. So let's look at what pay for performance is. So pay for performance is a conservation funding approach that links the payments to producers and landowners based off of environmental outcomes, as opposed to just paying for the specific practice itself, as you can see from the image on the right. So I've been using some AI-generated images to provide some comic relief in some of these presentations. And after looking at this particular transaction that was generated for me here, it's making me wonder what's really in that burlap bag. So let's go look a little bit further at the difference between the pay for practice and pay for performance. So in the pay for practice, if we're looking at cover crops or any of these practices, there's typically a payment in a dollar amount per acre. So it doesn't really matter where that practice is going on the landscape. Doesn't matter what the soil types are or any slopes or anything. It's just all the same payment for a given practice. So you have a fixed payment. And I say this jokingly a little bit, but we spin the wheel to find out what the actual performance of that practice will be at that location. It might yield a little bit of phosphorus reduction or sediment reduction. It might yield a lot, or in some cases, it might actually contribute and make the problem worse. So, pay for practices by itself is not bad, and there are a lot of great practices, that we're aware of for reducing sediment on fields. If you've gone out to a grass waterway and just seen what the benefits of those on keeping soil on the field, it makes a big difference. But if you're not measuring for specific environmental outcome, you could be making the problem worse. So if we go to paying for performance as the measure, in the same scenario, if we're looking at a cover crop that's here, we'll take that information and we'll look at the specific soil types, the slopes, precipitation, other management practices that have been happening in that field, evapotranspiration, and a whole bunch of other factors that the model then looks at to estimate the phosphorus reduction at that particular location. And so not every field is going to perform exactly the same. So the payment rates for those will be based off of the reduction. So in our case, we're looking at phosphorus. So there'll be a smaller amount or a smaller payment for a smaller amount, and then larger payments for larger amounts of phosphorus reduced. So does performance really matter? In the next slide, we'll take a look at some work that we previously did in the river raising, looking at various implementation of conservation practices and this kind of first come, first serve approach. So some earlier work we did in the river raising, we modeled 470 random fields of various sizes and shapes across the river raising watershed. Those are the little kind of dark square areas speckled across the watershed there. We then looked at NRCS conservation practices that were typically installed during that time frame, and we then assigned those conservation practices to each one of those fields. These were cover crops, filter strips, crop rotations, nutrient management. And then we took each one of those fields and we plotted those on a graph here. So each one of the dots that you see represents one of those fields with one of those conservation practices applied. Across the bottom of the graph is the phosphorus reduction in pounds. And then if you go up the y-axis, that is the total payment that was spent on that particular field for that given conservation practice. So you'll see here everything to the left of 0 actually contributed phosphorus. So in this case, this was 30 to maybe 40% of the conservation practices that went in place actually increased phosphorus. So, actually paying for a practice and making the problem worse in this particular case. The remaining ones over to the right reduce phosphorus and at various levels. So we could look at specific high performers here. These are kind of the outliers. This one cost $585 and reduced about 300 pounds of phosphorus at $1.95 per pound, versus on the other extreme, this particular field cost $19,000 and added 15 pounds of phosphorus. So, as you can see, if you don't take performance into account, you may actually pay for practices that make the problem that you're trying to address worse. So pay for performance programs in Michigan, they're not new. We've had a number of them. These are some that I listed. I know at least one or two additional ones that aren't included here, but starting maybe around 2010 to 2011, we started seeing a number of pay for performance type programs that were implemented. They were all kind of conducted a little differently. Some used reversed auctions. Some had specific payments for like $1 per environmental reduction, say sediment or nutrients, were the two primary ones. Or some had a like a minimal efficiency threshold that they used as a measure. But in all cases, they had mechanisms to measure the performance and connect those back to payments. I worked directly with, I think, probably more than half, at least half or more than half of the programs I just showed in the previous slide. Spoke with a number of the project leads, and for ones that I wasn't connected to, read some of the reports and tried to summarize lessons learned from those pay for performance programs and apply that to the program that we're working on now in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So from left to right, these were a few of the highlight takeaways that we're going to try to implement into ours, is to really simplify the process for contracting, modeling, and enrolling producers into the program. So really try to make that as simple as possible. Understand the needs of the users, the policy frameworks, and the program. Particularly some of these, we're looking at TMDLs and NPDES permits. And so really understanding what those policy frameworks are, is important for those in particular. And then really what the outcomes of your program that you're really trying to achieve. Next was to create a flexible program, have the ability to create the program in a way that really fits the end users, getting that feedback and not being rigid in the program, having the ability to be able to change that over time. Compensating the technical assistance providers with incentives or funding. This came up in several programs that, one of the things that they'd wish is that they had set additional funding aside for that. Explaining how the models and tools work for estimating reductions. Again, this came up from some producers in the Saginaw Bay where they really, appreciated having understanding how the models worked. And that was really important for their buy-in to the program, to know that it just kind of wasn't a black box where numbers were being cranked out, but having an understanding of that. So we actually are working on some videos of how we're using SWAT, the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, in our program, and those will become available here in the next month or two. Also evaluating the process throughout to remove any barriers. This is a big one that we really want to try to do is have continual feedback as we're going through the process, so that anything that comes up, we can make modifications and have an adaptive process for reducing any barriers that might come in place. And then also don't underestimate the time for verifications. We heard this on several projects, and just making sure that we either have funding set aside for that, or a time or a process that really accounts for how much time that takes. So you can summarize the benefits of pay for performance programs with these kind of 5 points. I won't read through each one of these, individually, but I think I'd like to focus maybe on 3 and 4. Particularly with using public funds, having accountability be an important part of the project is a thing that we really want to pay a lot of attention to. And having these sort of programs, pay for performance, really gives the ability to quantify each of the practices and be very transparent about the process, so we know exactly how much was being paid, what amount of phosphorus is being reduced, and those are all going into a nutrient tracking dashboard that's assisting the state in quantifying all the different programs that are going in place and what those phosphorus reductions are to help toward the state's phosphorus reduction goals. And then number 4, encouraging private sector investments to help meet environmental targets. This pay for performance approach has really been beneficial in trying to bring in additional dollars into these programs. So we're not always looking at, state or federal funding, but we also have some private investments. And this came or was pretty visible with work that the Nature Conservancy did with Coca-Cola and the Paw Paw River watershed, and with Keurig and Method Company in the Saginaw. And in those cases, those companies were interested in offsetting water use, so they were looking at increasing groundwater recharge. But the same conservation practices that they were paying producers to put in on a per gallon or a dollar per gallon of groundwater recharge, the same practices that are reducing sediment and keeping phosphorus in the field. So you can really bring in or have the potential to bring in private sector investments in these programs, which can help get a lot more on the ground. So this is the landing page that we have for our pay for performance program for Western Lake Erie Basin. This is the draft version. We're just working through a few more iterations and completing a few additional slides that will then, or web pages that we'll be working with our internal and external groups for reviewing. You'll be able to access various parts of the process for enrollment, field evaluations and verification, and also payment processing in this center area here. And then we hope to have some testing of this probably in, I think, January and February timeframes. So I'll talk a little bit about the process that we're using for developing this program, kind of each of the major steps, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail about specific steps for enrollment. So the first thing we're doing is developing the SWAT model. The SWAT model is really the engine behind all of our estimates that we're using for the program. So this estimates the phosphorus reductions that are occurring from the conservation practices that are being implemented on the field. SWAT stands for the Soil and Water Assessment Tool. It's an open source model that was developed by USDA ARS. It has thousands of peer-reviewed publications. This graph just kind of shows some of the yearly publications, both domestically and internationally. So it's a very well-known model, probably the most publicized model as far as watershed models is concerned. The calculations, assumptions, inputs, and outputs are all detailed and accessible. So it's not a black box. All the information is available to find out how that model works, and lots of reviews on it. To kind of highlight some of the inputs and outputs for that, the SWAT model looks at precipitation, temperature, wind speed, solar radiation, relative humidity, land use, soil and topography, and it takes that information and then provides outputs looking at runoff, soil erosion, and water quality on what they call HRUs. These are hydrologic response units, or kind of really small watersheds. And they do that on a daily, monthly, and yearly time step. We've developed a SWAT model for the entire Michigan Western Lake Erie Basin. We had an original SWAT model that for the river raisin that we converted to SWAT Plus, and then additional watersheds were developed in SWAT Plus, and then those were combined into one large model that we have now. That was calibrated for observations at USGS gauge stations, and then evapotranspiration rates from MODIS, and then NAS for the crop yields. And then we ran 9,000 plus simulations on various conservation practice combinations across the model. And again, those are what will be the driver for estimating reductions in our program. Next, we went through the process of selecting conservation practices. These practice sets here are what will likely be available in our first year. These are subsurface fertilizer placement, cover crops, grass waterways and filter strips, water and sediment control basins, nutrient management, no-till and reduced till, cover crops, low productivity and land retirement, drainage water management. There will likely be maybe one or two that either may not be on this list or one or two that might come into it in addition. But for the most part, these are the practices that we've honed in on with our advisory group and additional feedback. And then we'll be making our kind of final decisions on those and at the beginning of January. Next, we went into developing the payment rate. We've been getting feedback from our advisory team on both of these areas for the conservation selection and payment rate. We've been comparing different programs' payment rates. Vermont Pay for Performance paid about $100 per pound of phosphorus reduction with a cap of $50,000. H2O Ohio's reduction in phosphorus loads from B&Ps varied from $71 to $114 per pound of phosphorus. We also looked at various phosphorus removal structures, which varied from about $45 to $590 per pound of phosphorus. And then previous work that we did in the River Raisin watershed resulted in costing about $26 per pound of phosphorus reduction. So to give you an example, the table on the right here looks at if we had 100 acres in cover crops or crop rotation, the estimate we have for SWAT, and this is just an average again because each of the fields perform a little bit differently. But if we looked at an average across a watershed for cover crops, it's about 0.4 pounds per acre of reduction. And so if we use that and applied $26 per pound, we get a payment for the producer of about $1,136. If we went all the way up to 150, we'd be looking at about $6,555. For crop rotation, it's a little bit less effective, so about 0.085 pounds per acre of phosphorus reduction, again, average. And so at 26, we'd be looking at 221 up to about a little over $1,200 for $150 per pound of phosphorus. So we've been getting feedback from our advisory team on this. We are looking at all these different programs and we're honing in on that dollar amount. We hope to have final decisions for these all in January. The next step is developing the quantifications and contracting tools. That was the web page that I showed you. So we're in the process of those right now, creating those different interfaces. And then we'll do the testing for that moving forward. Once we get those set up, we'll start enrolling producers. For the producers, we have a number of different groups that we're working with, including ag retailers, millers, drainage installers, conservation organizations, and conservation districts that we'll be working with to help us. These would be the technical assistance providers that will help connect the farmers to the program. Once they've enrolled a producer and they've installed the practice, there'll be a verification process. Once that's been verified, payments will go out to the producers, and that's run by the conservation district. Lenawee conservation districts will be running those. And then it'll go into a nutrient tracking dashboard. I want to spend a little bit of time on the next slide and look a little bit closer at this process for enrolling the producers and what that looks like. So if we go into more detail with that, the first step will be having the technical assistant providers meet with the producers, talk about various conservation practices that they might be interested in doing. They'll use the online tools that we have developed to look at a specific field, take that field, and they can run various scenarios to look at, what the outcome or the phosphorus reduction would be for applying, either some stacked practices, or looking at, if we did no-till on this field, or if we put a buffer strip, or if we did crop rotation, what would those yield? In addition to that, the technical assistance providers can have conversations with some maps that we will have included from Bruno Basso at MSU that looks at low or unstable yield portions of the field. And, we're looking to be able to have those technical assistance providers have some conversations to look at those unstable or low producing areas of the field to see if, there's opportunities to move those into conservation. Oftentimes, there are a lot of input costs that go into fertilizer and seed, and certain parts of the fields just may not produce. And so you could actually have the field, be more profitable to the producer if they're able to take some of those areas out of production and put those into conservation. Once they've looked at a given field and are interested in putting something in, they can run through the model and get a result. In this case, if they're looking at 40 acres of cover crops, the system tells them there's a reduction of 20 pounds, tells them the payment rate, and then what their payment will be. If they're interested in that, they can go ahead and go through the enrollment process, and that will get them enrolled. One of the things I wanted to share here that's come up a few times is this reduction in phosphorus of 20 pounds, say in this case. There's been questions about, for our program, do you need to monitor the performance of that practice at the field? And this case for our program, that's not the case. What we want to do is we're going to use the models to estimate the phosphorus reduction. And as long as the producer is putting in the practice as defined through our program and it's verified, then they get the payment amount. So we're not doing like a specific monitoring of that field. There is monitoring going on in the basin that loosely will try to connect with this program and other programs to see what the conservation practices are yielding as far as water quality benefits over time. But our particular program just is relying on the modeled results. So that practice will get put into place by the producer, or they might be working with a provider to do a service. And then there'll be a verification. This can be as simple as the producer taking a picture of cover crops coming up, and then maybe a picture of the seed tag. They can also work with a technical assistance provider if they'd like to try to get that in, but we want to encourage producers to submit this information. So they would submit that, the details of that verification, and then we would have somebody at MSU who will be reviewing those. Once they've reviewed the documentation, they'll indicate within the system that the field's been verified. And then somebody from the conservation district will send payments out to the producers. And then lastly, this nutrient reduction dashboard is being developed right now for the state of Michigan. This is a place where all the different programs in Michigan that are reducing phosphorus are being input into this system to help track the nutrient reduction goals for the Western Lake Erie Basin. So this will be one of several programs that are providing their inputs into this system. And this will be not detailed information. You won't be able to look at particular farmers' fields input. All the information within our system will be private. Data will be aggregated at the 12 digit. So if you kind of look at one of these larger watersheds here, so we might have total phosphorus reductions within that area. So everybody within this program and other programs will be lumped up together and just show the phosphorus reductions in that watershed. In addition to tracking nutrients, the system tracks various additional ecosystem benefits. So we also are modeling groundwater recharge, looking at pollinator habitat, carbon sequestration, soil health parameters, sediment savings, and then also runoff reductions. At the moment, we're trying to mull through, and we'll have a conversation with our advisory team on one of our future meetings about how we might want to incorporate this. But at the moment, we're just right now just trying to capture. We know that the conservation practices that are being implemented provide other benefits outside of just phosphorus reduction. So we really wanted to be able to capture that just to show what some of the investments that the state's making, how those are paying off in different ways. We also have an advisory committee, and that committee is helping us think through the different decision points that we have. I'll go through some of those that we've had with our advisory groups in just a couple slides. But we have 20 different organizations that are contributing on our advisory board, a number of conservation districts, nonprofit organizations. We have representatives from various state departments, farmers that are all sitting on the board and providing kind of feedback to help us kind of hone in on the specific questions that we're trying to get details in. And then we take that back to our internal team and discuss those to make final decisions. We've had 2 meetings so far with our advisory board. First one was in early October. And we talk with them about best management practices, which ones should be included in the program. That's kind of helped on that list that I just showed you a little bit ago. We have a couple, additional outliers that we're having further discussion on that we'll land on here shortly. And then talked about what incentives should be offered to organizations that are enrolling producers. In our December meeting, we looked at mechanisms that this program could include for extending longevity of conservation practice adoption. Started looking at some of the incentive payment rates on a per dollar per pound basis, looking at the different programs that were involved and what payment rates they had, and trying to understand, should we be focusing on total phosphorus or dissolved reactive phosphorus? And so these are, again, some of the decisions talking about if we want to include bonus payments for 5 priority watersheds or practices that are there. For future meetings in February, we have our next meeting and then another one in April. Again, these are just, lists of the types of questions that we're working through with our advisory board. We'll be trying to nail down the definitions for the given practices that we finally land on. So we'll have an identification of what that practice will be, describing how that needs to get implemented, and what the verification for that one would be. We'll also look at trying to get feedback from our advisory group on the interface design that we're working on in that February meeting. And then moving forward, looking at, how do we track those additional ecosystem services? And are there some ways that we can, recognize or acknowledge existing conservation practices that are happening from producers already in the basin, or how do we provide some recognition or acknowledgement or rewards or awards for technical assistance providers who are also enrolling producers into the program. So these are some of the further future discussions that we'll have with our advisory team. And lastly, we've also started to work with commodity groups, corn, wheat, soybean, and milk. We've had several conversations. We try to align these somewhat with our advisory team. So our advisory team, we're trying to meet bi-monthly right now. And then afterward, we meet with our commodity groups and have some discussions just to get feedback from them. Some of the commodity groups may actually be technical assistance providers for the program. So we really want to understand and listen to them about, how that process is going, get feedback from them, from their members about, any questions that they have on the program or how we might tweak it in order to make it more successful. And then we're also trying to bring in drainage contractors. We haven't had a chance to connect with them yet, but are hoping to reach out to them in the next several weeks here.